Hello, welcome back to our Spring Boot series. Today I would like to talk about how to configure the address when accessing our application using REST controller and to return the correct values to the client. For instance, if I try to get a user and the user is not found, we shouldn't return null. We should return something like 404, meaning not found in HTTP. Okay, and of course I will introduce something called ResponseEntity that can help us to return these code values. So let's see the current status of our application. So during the last sessions, in the application properties, I changed the path of our application to use finance, and rather than using the common 8080 port, I'm using now the 9000. It was just to introduce the configurations in our application, so I changed the port and changed the name, and now I'm not returning to the previous ones since the properties they are already configured for these values. And we are using an H2 database in memory to handle or simulate a real database. But at the end of the day, this database, it's a real database and can work as a server. It's not popular in production, because in production we want scalable database and things like that. But it is very, very useful for these kind of scenarios when we are teaching. Even for testing scenarios, it's a really, really good database. Even in production, if you want to use it internally to perform queries, not with production data, but maybe you want to insert hundreds or thousands on rows and perform some queries and return values rather than using classes and lists and collections and streams in Java, it's okay also, but I have my doubts about the performance compared to native implementation of lists, but it's a different way to use it. So let's return to our subject. So this is the configuration for the server. If you remember, if you don't, you can always consult my previous videos. And these are configuration for our database that I explained in detail in a previous video. I even created, I think, five or six videos about this database H2 that you can follow if you want to learn more about it. So, and as you know, we can create these two SQL files, one with a schema, which makes our Spring Boot application to execute this create table in the H2 database in memory, and we insert two users at least so we can test the data for now. So let's start our application, and then I will explain the code to configure our REST controller. So let's start here, run. So for those that they know about Spring Boot, you don't see here the banner because in the application properties, as I explained during a previous talk, you can always disable it like this, Spring main banner mode off. So everything seems to be working okay. We are on the port 19. This is the path that we are using, and we have access to the database if you want from a web browser using this address H2 console that can be configured here on this property. Okay, let's see our code, our users REST controller. So we had already this method called users that returns all the users in database. It uses the service and the users DAO, and of course the table and data that we created. But now we want to provide a single user, meaning that we want to write something users/1, and it should return the user with the ID 1. And the way to do it, it's like this. We use these curly braces. After we put this in plural, the previous version was just user, so I change in this version, okay, like this. And we put slash, and this is a pattern. It means that it's a placeholder for a number, meaning that when the request arrives at the Spring Boot, this method will handle the users, and this one handles the user slash with something here. And the something is configured in the parameter. We write path variable, int ID, like this. So we expect an integer here. It can be a different data type, like a string or whatever we want. But the Spring Boot will handle the pattern associated with this, will take the number from the URL, and we'll insert it as a parameter in our method. Now we have access to this ID, so we can call now the user service getUserById that was previously developed that returns an optional user. And by the way, for those who are following our series, previously I was returning a user here on the method getUserById. I replace now with an optional because we don't want to return null when it's not found. That's one of the things we added to do here, that I remove it and just put as an option. And of course, I remove it here, the or else null. So I'm returning the value as is that came from the user's DAO. Okay, let's return to our REST controller. So here we have our optional user, which can be empty or contain a real user. And now we can use this response entity. It's something that I will should go more deeply in a future video. But for now, consider it as a wrapper around the HTTP call. Meaning that if I return user, I should return a user and it will be generated a JSON, or a null when it's empty. Okay, if it doesn't exist, we don't know what to return. But we want to return something like, okay, if there is a user, I want to return a 200, okay, which is the HTTP status about saying, okay, you asked me for something and I have that something for you. But if I couldn't find the user, I don't want to return null. I just want to return nothing, but saying I couldn't find it, which is the 404 code in HTTP. And this response entity can help us on that. On the outside, we will not see these response entities realized. We will still see the user only when it exists, but when the user doesn't exist, we receive a different code, and we can handle that code. The client can understand that, okay, I asked for this user, but the user doesn't exist because I have explicitly code. I will not check for null, because null sometimes it's too vague. Null can mean I didn't find it or something strange happened. We never know. That's why it's a good practice to use the HTTP codes that are in the standard to tell to the client what is the real result. And in this case, we can say, okay, let's use the map from the optional and say, okay, if everything is okay, just give a response entity okay. Okay means 200 if you go into the documentation, or else, meaning that, okay, if it's not okay, so respond with the response entity not found and build. That's the way to generate. Not found, it's the same as 404 return code. And that's one way to do it. There are other ways, but this is the one most popular when using Spring Boot, and it's just a wrapper. It doesn't change the output. It just, let's say, enrich the output. So the output will be more useful for the clients. So let's see this running. Okay, I installed the Postman. It's not necessary. We can use still a browser, but I wanted to show these codes here. So if you want, pause the video, install the Postman. It has a free version that we can use, and it's quite simple because we just write here our address, and you can have the option to parameterize parameters, authorization, something that we'll do in the further videos. And then here we have the output when the output exists. So let's start first with our port, our finance, which is the address of our server, and the users, and we expect to see all the users. So let's send here, and we can see on the output in JSON, first you can see here the 200, okay, meaning, okay, everything went well. Okay, and now we have here the user 1 and user 2 that exists on the database. Now let's check what happens using the other pattern. So I can do something like, let's say 1. The 1 exists, we are finding by ID, and the 2 also exists. So when I do send here, you can see the reply 1. It's okay with the 200. Okay, this 200 here, it is this okay. If you see this method, we are not using ResponseEntity. We can use, but it's a list. And usually the list, when we have a list, I don't see any reason to use the ResponseEntity, because when we get all the users, when it's not found, it's not the same thing, because when we get a set of things, there is no such thing as not found. What exists, it's empty. Give me all the users, and if there are no users, it's not that the users were not found, because we are not getting for a specific thing. So we expect an empty, so it will be an empty list, the result. And when there are users, the list, of course, will not be empty. So there is no reason to respond with okay and not found. It will always be okay unless there is an error, but the result will be empty or not. It's different. We have in a list or a collection, we have the concept of empty, but in a specific variable value, there is no such thing as empty, or there is a value or it's not. Let's say like a user, or a user exists or it doesn't exist. There is no empty user. It's not that we return a user with empty properties. It's not the same as a collection. That's why it's common practice to use optional when we get a specific thing, but in lists we don't use the optional. That's one of the reasons the option was created, to avoid the null to be returned for single objects. But let's return to our optional, to other optional and Postman, of course. So let's try a different one, like 3 here, okay, and we do a send, and you can see that there is nothing returned, but you can see here that we see the 404 not found. And this is very useful if you are developing React, Vue, Angular, or even a service calling another service, because now when you ask for this user, you can reply, say, I didn't find that user. It is not an error. Not found, it's not an error. It's a standard code protocol that says, I couldn't find what you're looking for. It's like when you go to the browser and put an address that doesn't exist, it doesn't throw an error. Just say in a message, say, okay, try to find that address, but I couldn't find that address. So 404, it's the standard for this kind of things, and we are following the standard that we should follow, of course, as developers and good software engineers that we want to become, or probably already are. Okay, so this is the thing that I want to show you today, how to perform parameters on the address here on the REST controller, and how to control the output of the HTTP codes using the response entity. So now you can improve your application. You can get all the users or any other entity. You can even customize the address and call for specific ones. If you if you want, you can add more like this. It's no problem. The Spring Boot can handle this kind of things, HT2 and things like that. Okay, maybe we'll get into this in further videos, but for now, this one, I think it's a step ahead in our learning in this Spring Boot world. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe, share with your friends. I'm trying to provide value and knowledge that I have, and I hope you like it. And please comment, subscribe again, and thank you for watching.